The primary change has been in the recirculation systems that are installed, and at this point it looks like where recirculation systems are installed in a house, they will be required to be demand activation, either by flow sensing, occupant switching, and having a sort of a fairly specific control requirements of how many degrees of temperature rise the sensor has to see before it shuts off. Primarily trying to minimize, a lot of this minimizes waste in just water use in general, but also alleviates the need for people to turn their shower on, walk around for 5 minutes, thinking that they're waiting for the water to get hot, and wasting the hot water. So that's a fair amount of information in there in those many of those changes. There was also some clarification on pipe insulation. Uses reasonable physics based on the diameter of the pipe and the larger piping with different pipe insulation requirements versus smaller piping, based on the actual heat loss that these larger or smaller pipes would carry. So that was the primary issues with water heating. There was other plumbing code changes that were related to looking at allowing smaller diameter piping to be used. Gary Klein, who's been advocating this for years, has been putting in these code changes. There's a lot of reluctance on the plumbing code part to accept using quarter-inch or predominantly 3/8 piping for home-run systems, which can save water, can save time and effort, allows for sort of bundled tubes of these small diameter pipes to be run, and can get hot water to a faucet from a remote water heater in less than a cup or 2 cups of water when you're using these small diameter pipes that are run to each individual location. That was not the Energy Committee accepted that as a code change, but the Plumbing Committee did not. So the Plumbing Committee is probably going to win the day on that one. So the HVAC equipment itself, there's really with no changes. Typically, the code has not done anything about the efficiency of heating or cooling equipment, and with the reintroduction of the performance path, this code change really was just to recognize that at a minimum, as a mandatory piece of equipment, you have to meet the federal minimum efficiencies for heating and cooling equipment. It's somewhat redundant in that you can't technically buy anything but federal minimum efficiencies for that equipment, but it does state that if you're doing the energy calculations and trade-offs, that you have to use the minimum efficiencies for that, the energy calculations there. So, the next one. There was quite a bit of duct information. A lot of this was to get the residential code in alignment with the changes that happened last year on the mechanical code section, the International Mechanical Code, which was reviewed and voted on last year. But there are some clarifications as to where and how much duct insulation is necessary. Again, reiterates the ability to take duct tightness as a trade-off component in the performance path. There is some specific language about duct sealing of snap seams and button lock systems on metal ducts that need to be taken into account. There are also some classifications for the duct sealants that go onto ducts. Not anything new or different, but just a better clarification of the UL 181 duct sealant requirements of tapes versus sealants. There is also, historically, there was a limit on total leakage for duct systems in the testing of the 2012 code. That is now also taken as a duct leakage to the outside. So if you're doing a performance path and looking to do a duct leakage to the outside. You don't have to be any better than the total leakage, but you can't, it does set a limit on the leakage to the outside. The last one is just a criteria for how to model ducts if you're going through a performance approach. What is the equivalent expected leakage of a mandatory or prescriptive path duct system, so that you can do the equivalent modeling in the performance path. So that's an important piece that's needed to be able to do the home energy ratings in that mechanism. So next. There was a little bit of work on both kind of makeup air for range hoods and outside, what the difference between outside and return air. On the makeup air, this change specifically lets builders do a mechanical makeup air system, which would be perhaps a barometric damper or other mechanical damper systems, as opposed to the previous code, which had required a mechanical system, required a mechanical system, and now what they consider a natural makeup air system, which might have something like a barometric damper, as opposed to a motorized damper for range hoods. They've also brought consistency with the International Mechanical Code changes on updating outside and return air, kind of bringing it into the 21st century. A lot of the code language that was in there was very outdated, and it's looks like a good change on that respect. And then finally, there was a couple of changes on thermostats, making it clear that the thermostats have to be programmed by a manufacturer. Apparently there were code officials who were looking at, there is a requirement in the code that thermostats must be programmable, and the builder and the code official wasn't quite clear who was responsible for making that meet the minimum code defaults. The code change has been specifically that falls on the shoulders of the manufacturers if they weren't already doing that. And also clarifying that in houses with multiple systems, the programmable thermostat's only required for the main system. So that
could save you some time, which is certainly money, and it could save you some money in terms of making it the responsibility of the manufacturer.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of confusion. I mean, it's one less checklist item that a builder would have to go through in looking at a code compliance, and again, going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some may inspect for it, some may not. This should help clarify that and make it a little bit simpler on the inspection side. So, the next one was better clarification of solar. I think historically in the code, solar has just sort of been lumped together, and these code changes all related to specifically clarifying what is a solar thermal system for hot water and what is a PV system for electric generation. So it's good to have that, I think, distinction now with the rapid influx of PV that's coming into the market, and helps inspectors know what they are looking for and what the requirements are for these various systems. It also requires a mixing valve for solar thermal to prevent scalding, and there are some requirements in the section on PV about what are the standards that need to be complied with for roof-mounted PV. A lot of this, again, is creating documentation in the code so that when your manufacturers are getting their code approval sheets, that they have something to rely on, that the code official can reference back to the code. So, not a lot of changes there, not a lot of improvements or additional activity to do, but just better clarification on those. And finally, for those of you doing wood-burning fireplaces, not a lot, but they will be required to have a tight-fitting damper or door system. The dampers were already in the code, but doors have been added. And that when a fireplace, wood-burning fireplace, has a UL 127 listing, typically a manufactured fireplace, wood-burning fireplace, as opposed to a site-built, that the doors must be tested as part of that assembly in the UL 127 test and listed with the device. The manufacturers don't want people retrofitting their fireplaces with tight-fitting doors when they have not been tested as a comprehensive sort of system in unit. So those are kind of the big things. I think it may be a sigh of relief for a lot of people who've seen the code going up and up and up and up over the last 6-8 years. I think there's a recognition that a lot of the cost-effective areas, and perhaps many might argue there's non-cost-effective stuff into the codes now. But I guess the only question on our end is there anything that you all perceive or see that the code is lacking in or could be stronger in? There may be. Now, one thing to recognize, I went through the changes that were approved, but there were, as Betsy mentioned in the outset, there were over 2,000. There are over 2,000 code changes that were submitted across all of the codes in this group. So there may be code changes that were defeated that could apply to being able to having being able better to build that may have been defeated, that could be looked for and put in for public comment, find out what the objections are to that, and is there a way to modify that language that could overcome those objections and be approved at the final hearings. So I guess this is an opportunity to share that. If there's anybody who's got comments, questions, or others on this.
Again, if you would walk us through this air sealing piece here that you think is a good thing that's missing, wasn't currently approved, and then we'll open the floor back up.
Okay, yeah, I put a code change in, having tested the numbers of houses, mostly townhouse construction, where there's a shaft wall, gypsum shaft wall construction for the fire separation assembly, and that typically is a very leaky, non-airtight assembly, and we put something in that would allow some combustible sealants to be put in there, spray foam or caulk or sealant, something that allows that to be used without having to go through a complete new UL fire test, which costs $30,000 or $40,000, my understanding. The Energy Committee passed it. The Residential Committee thought that, they felt like there was no proof that this would make the fire separation assemblies less or any safer, that this wouldn't compromise the safety of these tested assemblies. So with the exception of 2 builder members on the Residential Committee, that motion failed in the Residential Committee. There was a number of objections from various interested stakeholders. Found it interesting the Iron and Steel Institute was there, I think possibly because I referenced combustible wall assemblies, and they have non-combustible wall assemblies, so they're, but be that as may, we're going to be pursuing this, trying to talk with the objectors, whether there's a way that we can include this information with other sort of prescriptive requirements, and if not, what would the minimum testing that we could end up doing that would allow the greatest number of sealants or materials to be included in these UL fire separation walls to help builders achieve the pretty stringent air tightness standards, particularly if they're going after the prescriptive path with the 5 ACH 50 in southern climates and 3 ACH 50 in northern climates. So that's one area that we're going to be pursuing in this over the course of the next month or so. And we may be looking for support in terms of public comment for this code change. So, anyone else got questions, issues, or concerns?
Duncan, this is Rob Brooks. One of the thoughts I had on that, what you just referenced is, the Gypsum Association has a test, fire resistance test, that they use to qualify Type X. And
Yep.
It's basically a wall assembly with wood studs, and just has gypsum right over the top of it. And it's a standard test that's just run just dozens and dozens of times, and gypsum qualifies if it makes an hour. I wonder if you could run something and put one of those combustible sealants in one of those assemblies and see if it still makes an hour.
Well, I think that's the worst case situation. We would like to get away from that. That I don't believe that it's going to have any. People I've talked to don't think this is going to be an issue who've done fire tests over and over. That the amount of sealant and the type of sealant is not going to be detrimental to that test. What I was proposing is that the materials used basically have the same auto ignition temperature as wood. So if the wood's going to be burning in there, how much more fuel contribution is in that may or may not pass. So we're going to be reaching out to gypsum manufacturers, people who do a lot of these fire tests, to sort of talk through a little bit more about whether or how we might be able to get this passed through. But ultimately, that would be the worst case scenario, is to go through and do that test again.
I think one of the things you need to do is you need to specify the maximum quantity.
Yep.
Of sealant, because it was sort of infinite.
Right. Right.
As proposed.
Yeah. So I think we'll look at what are reasonable quantities per square foot or something to that effect. Per square foot of wall area, is there a volume per wall area or something like that we could limit it to as well. So.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Anyone else with any initial comments, thoughts, suggestions?
Duncan, this is Don Stevens.
Hey, Don.
Question for you on items being heard both by IECC and by IRC Energy. How are those differences being ironed out?
It's not clear to me yet how those are things that have passed the energy code but didn't pass the residential code.
Yeah, exactly. The original intent 3 years ago, was to have one energy code to deal with rather than having two. And I know that there was some lobbying, I guess, for lack of a worse word, to make them separate. And what's the status on how they're resolving those issues?
I'm not sure. The way they split it up this year was that if you put a code change in that had a component in the residential code and a component in the energy code, that the energy section was heard by the energy group and the residential was heard by the residential group, but it was the same code change. So it's not clear to me that what they did was they divided it into what they call parts. So it's not clear to me whether if you got one part approved and another part disapproved, whether it's going to go into the section that it got approved in and not in the section that it didn't get approved in, which would effectively make it not doable, because if you can't have, they sort of go hand in hand. So it hasn't been made clear how those are going to be kind of justified or harmonized at this point.
Okay, that's what I was trying to figure out.
We could ask and find out and then share that information with you if we find anything out.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Duncan, this is Dean Potter. I have two things that I'd like to mention that may be interest to the people on the call and to you folks as well, and you were there so you'll know what I'm talking about. there were a number of, well, there was one particular code official in particular representing the International Association of Building Officials, a new organization to represent building officials. And the reason I think it's important for people to know that is on many issues they were supportive of the builder's position on increased stringency and increased requirements in the energy code. And it definitely had a significant impact on a couple of the votes, on the voice that they expressed. First of all, we and others are going to encourage that we join their association just so we can keep our eye and talk to them and become interactive with them. But we should support them to the extent that they are supporting the builder's view of overregulation on the energy codes. So that's one observation. If you want, I'll stop if you want to add anything to that.
Nope, that's good. Thank you.
If you have a contact name there, Dean, if you
I'll get you one. I don't have it right here in front of me, but he spoke at the construction codes committee meeting at Spring Boards last week, and I've met the guy. I'll get his name, Betsy, and send it on to you. Extremely. He's from a suburb of Kansas City, something Park. I forgot the name of the town, but in any case, they're very practical about the overburden of the building officials that the energy codes in particular are resulting in as these increased requirements of them are placed on them. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's a ratcheting up of conversation at ICC to extending the code cycles. And again, for this group and people on these calls to be aware of that, so that if you're in any environment where you're speaking to your local code official or anybody within your state's advocacy for adoption of codes, it's a disruption to our business to have to change the codes every 3 years. And there are states that are starting to simply not adopt the codes because the cycle times are too short. And so again, that's something that is, as I'm saying, is Dominic Sims, the CEO of ICC, is engaged in conversation, and they're considering that. So again, just as an FYI information.
Good, thank you.